No one warns you about this phase because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. And that's exactly why most people never survive it, because progress here has no shape, no applause, no visible proof, only repetition stacked on repetition while nothing seems to move. And in this phase, days blur together, weeks pass without milestones, months go by without recognition, and the mind begins to quietly whisper questions it never asked before. Is this even working? Not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, persistently, like a leak in the ceiling you try to ignore. Because the effort is real, the discipline is real, the hours are real, yet the results refuse to show themselves. And this mismatch between input and output is where the invisible phase begins, where the work continues but the reward disappears, where the external world gives you no signal that you're on the right path. And the hardest part is not the effort itself, but the uncertainty wrapped around it, because humans are not wired to work without feedback, without validation, without signs of progress. And yet mastery demands exactly that, prolonged effort in the absence of evidence. And this is where the silent samurai is forged, not in battle, not in victory, but in the quiet repetition that feels pointless until it isn't. Because slow progress doesn't announce itself. It hides inside microscopic improvements that only accumulate after long stretches of boredom. And most people misinterpret boredom as a sign to quit, but boredom is often the gatekeeper. Because when learning slows down, when growth becomes imperceptible, when enthusiasm fades and only structure remains, that's when the work becomes pure, stripped of emotion, stripped of excitement, stripped of fantasy, leaving behind only action. And action without emotional fuel is rare, because motivation burns fast and discipline burns slow. And this phase is too slow for motivation to survive, which is why people drop out here quietly, not with drama, not with failure, but with excuses that sound reasonable. I'll come back later. Maybe this isn't for me. I'm not seeing results. And they believe those excuses because nothing is visibly contradicting them, because the invisible phase provides no external resistance, no opponent, no crisis, only silence. And silence is uncomfortable because it reflects your doubts back at you without distortion. And in this silence, you begin to notice how much of your identity was tied to progress being visible, to effort being acknowledged, to growth being measurable. And when those things vanish, you're left alone with the raw question of whether you can continue without being seen. Because slow progress dismantles the ego first. It removes the feeling of becoming someone and replaces it with the feeling of doing something pointless. And the ego hates that, because the ego wants proof, status, comparison, timelines, while mastery only wants consistency. And this is the cruel paradox. The less visible your progress, the more important it is, because the invisible phase is not about improvement, it's about conditioning. It's about teaching the nervous system to operate without reward, to move without emotional reinforcement, to work even when the mind feels understimulated and unimportant. And this rewires something deep, something primitive, because when you keep showing up despite no visible gains, you are no longer driven by outcome. You are driven by identity. And identity-based action is far more durable than goal-based action, because goals expire, but identity compounds. And slow progress forces this shift by necessity, because if you rely on excitement here, you will fail. If you rely on inspiration, you will fail. If you rely on being in the mood, you will fail. Because the invisible phase removes all emotional crutches and leaves only routine. And routine feels mechanical, lifeless, almost meaningless at first. But inside that repetition, a quiet transformation begins, one you cannot feel while it's happening, because neural pathways strengthen silently, skill foundations deepen without flair, perception sharpens gradually, and discipline becomes automatic. And this is why the invisible phase feels empty, because it is busy building systems, not sensations. And humans confuse sensation with progress, but mastery doesn't care how you feel. It only cares whether you return tomorrow.
And the tragedy is that most people quit 1 inch before the shift happens, because the invisible phase ends abruptly, not gradually. And those who endure it often report that progress suddenly feels faster later, not because the work became easier, but because the foundation finally matured enough to express itself outwardly. But before that moment, before the breakthrough, there is this long stretch where effort seems unconnected to outcome. And this disconnect is not a flaw in the process, it is the filter, because only those who can tolerate slow progress without emotional reward are capable of holding mastery later without arrogance, because slow progress humbles you, it removes entitlement, it teaches patience at a cellular level, and this patience becomes a weapon later when others panic, rush, or burn out. And this is why the silent samurai does not complain during this phase, does not announce the struggle, does not seek reassurance, because speaking about slow progress invites external opinions that cannot understand internal development. And misunderstanding is dangerous here, because doubt spreads faster than discipline. And in the invisible phase, even a small doubt can feel like a permission to stop, which is why silence is strategic, because silence protects fragile growth, like keeping a seed underground until roots are strong enough to survive exposure. And this phase is underground work, unseen, uncelebrated, and often lonely, because people around you may assume you've stalled, plateaued, or failed, and correcting them would require explanation, and explanation would require justification, and justification weakens resolve. So you let them think what they want, because the invisible phase teaches emotional independence by force. It teaches you to detach from timelines, from comparison, from recognition, and to anchor yourself only to the process. And once this anchoring happens, something irreversible begins. You stop asking, "How long will this take?" and start asking, "What does the process require today?" And this shift marks the true beginning of mastery, even though externally nothing has changed yet. And this is the cruel beauty of slow progress. It feels like stagnation to the untrained mind, but it is acceleration disguised as nothing. And those who survive it emerge with a different relationship to effort, one that does not rise and fall with emotion, one that does not depend on validation, one that moves forward even when the world is silent. And that is why this phase is invisible, because if it were obvious, everyone would do it. But mastery has never been for everyone. It has always belonged to those who could continue walking when the road stopped giving signs. And this is where the silent samurai remains, moving forward quietly, steadily, without proof, without praise, without panic, knowing that slow progress is not a warning.
The doubt period does not arrive loudly or dramatically. It arrives calmly, almost politely, after you have already proven to yourself that you can be consistent, after the novelty has died and the routine has hardened. And that is what makes it dangerous, because by the time doubt appears, you are no longer struggling with effort, you are struggling with meaning. And doubt does not ask whether you are capable, it asks whether this is worth it, whether the time is justified, whether the sacrifice makes sense, whether you chose the right path. And these questions feel intelligent, rational, even responsible, which is why so many disciplined people fall here, because doubt wears the mask of wisdom, and unlike laziness, doubt does not tell you to stop immediately. It tells you to reconsider, to pause, to reassess, to be realistic. And that is far more lethal, because reassessment feels mature, while retreat happens quietly underneath it. And in this phase, the mind becomes hyperactive, scanning for evidence that you may be wrong, replaying small failures, magnifying minor inefficiencies, comparing your progress to others who seem to move faster with less effort. And the cruel part is that doubt often emerges not when things are going badly, but when they are going steadily. Because steady progress gives the mind enough space to wander, and in that wandering, the mind seeks stimulation, drama, certainty, something to react to.
And since external chaos is absent, it manufactures internal chaos instead, turning inward and questioning the entire structure you've built. And this is the phase where discipline alone is no longer enough, because discipline can move the body, but doubt attacks the narrative. And humans cannot sustain long-term effort without a narrative they trust. And doubt's primary weapon is narrative erosion. It slowly dissolves the story that justified your sacrifice, replacing it with alternate futures, alternate paths, hypothetical outcomes where quitting earlier would have been smarter, easier, more efficient. And these imagined futures feel real because they are emotionally comforting. Because doubt is not about truth, it is about relief. It offers relief from uncertainty by suggesting escape. And escape is always attractive when the destination is unclear. And during the doubt period, the destination is always unclear, because mastery still hasn't revealed itself, results are still partial, feedback is still limited, and the mind hates incomplete pictures, so it fills in the gaps with fear. And this fear doesn't scream, it whispers. It says things like, what if this never works? Or what if you're wasting years? Or what if you're not as talented as you thought? And these questions don't paralyze immediately. They chip away. They drain energy. They make effort feel heavier than before, not because the work changed, but because the belief system supporting the work is cracking. And this is why the doubt period feels mentally exhausting, even when physical effort remains the same, because now every action carries an internal debate alongside it. An internal debate is expensive, it consumes focus, it fragments attention, it turns simple routines into emotional negotiations. And once negotiation begins, consistency becomes fragile, because consistency requires decisiveness, not certainty. And doubt confuses the two, convincing you that you must be certain before you commit fully, when in reality, certainty only comes after commitment has already been sustained long enough to produce evidence. And this reversal traps many people in endless analysis loops, waiting for clarity that only action can generate. And during this period, you may notice a subtle change in behavior, not dramatic quitting, but micro delays, skipped sessions justified as rest, reduced intensity framed as balance, distractions allowed because you deserve a break. And these behaviors seem harmless individually, but together they signal the beginning of decay. Because doubt rarely destroys discipline all at once, it dissolves it slowly by making non-action feel reasonable. And the most dangerous part is that doubt feels personal. It feels like your own voice, your own insight, your own realization, which is why external advice often fails here, because anyone telling you to continue sounds naive, dismissive, or unaware of the complexity you are now seeing. And this perceived complexity feeds the ego, because doubt flatters intelligence. It makes you feel thoughtful, self-aware, analytical, when in reality, it is often just fear dressed up as intellect. And the silent samurai understands this distinction, understands that doubt is not an enemy to be fought emotionally, but a signal to reduce interpretation and increase execution. Because the mistake people make is trying to think their way out of doubt, but doubt is born from thinking. It cannot be solved at the same level it was created. And the more you analyze doubt, the stronger it becomes, because it thrives on attention. And this is where silence becomes critical, because speaking doubt externalizes it, gives it form, invites feedback, and feedback during doubt is unpredictable, because others may project their own fears on your uncertainty, reinforcing it unintentionally. And the silent samurai avoids this trap by keeping doubt private, not because doubt is shameful, but because it is volatile, and volatility spreads. And instead of seeking reassurance, the silent samurai tightens structure, simplifies decisions, reduces options, and returns to ritual. Because ritual bypasses narrative. Ritual does not require belief. It only requires obedience. And obedience to process during doubt is what separates those who pass through this phase from those who exit quietly, because the doubt period is not meant to be eliminated, it is meant to be outlasted. And this is difficult for modern minds that expect clarity before commitment, but mastery demands commitment before clarity, and doubt tests this order relentlessly. And as the doubt period continues, something subtle begins to happen if you do not retreat. The questions lose emotional charge, not because they were answered, but because they were ignored consistently enough to weaken. And the mind learns an uncomfortable lesson here, that its objections are not always decisive, that action does not require consensus from every internal voice. And this lesson is transformative, because once you realize you can continue even while doubting, doubt loses its power to control behavior. And this does not make you fearless, it makes you stable, because fear without authority is harmless, and doubt without control is just noise. And this is why those who survive the doubt period emerge quieter, less reactive, less interested in reassurance, because they have already seen how unreliable internal dialogue can be under uncertainty. And this is where emotional control deepens, not by suppressing doubt, but by refusing to obey it. And this refusal builds a new internal hierarchy, one where action outranks thought, where process outranks feeling, and where identity is no longer negotiated daily. And the irony is that doubt often peaks right before the silent breakthrough, because the system you are building is nearing completion internally, even though externally it still looks unfinished. And the mind senses the tension of this mismatch and reacts with urgency, trying to force resolution. But resolution does not come through decision here, it comes through endurance. And the doubt period ends not with a revelation, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with exhaustion of doubt itself, because doubt cannot sustain itself indefinitely without behavioral reinforcement. And when behavior refuses to change, doubt starves. And when doubt starves, something else takes its place, a quiet neutrality, a calm persistence, a sense that you will continue regardless of how you feel about it today. And this is the psychological threshold most people never cross, because it requires accepting uncertainty as a permanent companion, not a temporary inconvenience. And those who accept this move forward differently, not faster yet, not visibly stronger yet, but internally unshakable, because they have already survived the moment when the mind turned against them and failed to stop them. And that is why the doubt period is not a flaw in the path, it is the initiation, the moment where the mind tests whether you are serious enough to continue without believing in yourself every day. And the silent samurai passes this test, not by winning the argument, but by refusing to argue at all, continuing forward quietly, knowing that doubt is not a signal to stop, but a signal that the transformation is working beneath the surface.
The silent breakthrough never feels like a breakthrough when it happens. There is no dramatic moment, no emotional surge, no clear line where you can say, this is where everything changed, because the transition is internal before it is external. And that is why most people miss it while they are inside it, because the work does not suddenly feel easier. The days do not suddenly feel lighter. The effort does not suddenly feel rewarding. But something fundamental reorganizes beneath the surface, and the first sign is not success, it is stability. A quiet psychological stabilization where the chaos that once surrounded the process begins to fade, because the environment changed, but your relationship to the environment changed. And you stop reacting to small fluctuations, small failures, small delays, small uncertainties, because they no longer feel like threats to identity. And this is subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, because you are not chasing progress anymore. You are operating systems, and systems do not feel exciting. They feel neutral, predictable, almost boring.
And yet this neutrality is the breakthrough, because emotion no longer determines movement, and movement no longer requires emotional permission. And this is a radical shift in human behavior, because most people live in a loop of feeling first, acting second, while mastery inverts the loop, action first, feeling later. And once this inversion locks in, progress accelerates without sensation, because the friction that used to slow you down internally is gone, and what remains is structure, rhythm, execution, and consistency without internal resistance. And this is where the invisible phase ends psychologically, even if externally nothing dramatic has happened yet, because the internal architecture is now stable, and stability is the platform for expression. And one of the strangest aspects of the silent breakthrough is that your perception of time changes, because the urgency that once drove you fades, and with it the impatience, the constant scanning for results, the hunger for signs, the anxiety about speed. And this creates a calm tempo, a slower internal pace that paradoxically allows faster output, because urgency fragments focus, while calm consolidates it. And in this calm state, attention becomes sharper, decisions become simpler, and energy stops leaking into unnecessary mental loops. And people around you may not notice this change immediately because it is not loud, it is not expressive, it is not performative. But they will feel it indirectly through your behavior, through your consistency, your reliability, your lack of emotional volatility, your quiet confidence that does not need reinforcement. And this is the beginning of quiet authority, the kind that is not claimed but assumed, not announced but recognized. And this authority comes from internal coherence, from the alignment between what you do and who you are becoming. Because at this stage, identity and behavior begin to merge. And when identity and behavior align, there is no internal friction, no self-negotiation, no need for discipline as a force, because discipline has transformed into default behavior. And this is why the silent breakthrough feels uneventful, because the struggle that once defined the process is gone, and humans often mistake struggle for progress. So when a struggle disappears, they think nothing is happening, when in reality the system is now functioning efficiently, and efficiency feels quiet. And another sign of the silent breakthrough is emotional compression, not numbness, but control, where emotional reactions become shorter, smaller, more contained, because you no longer interpret events as personal threats to your trajectory. And this emotional compression creates mental space, and mental space allows deeper focus, deeper learning, deeper perception, because the mind is no longer overloaded with self-referential noise. And this is where flow state becomes accessible, not as a mystical experience, but as a practical state of sustained attention, where time distortion happens naturally, not because the task is exciting, but because the mind is no longer fighting the task. And this is a crucial distinction. Excitement is unstable, but acceptance is stable. And mastery grows in stability, not stimulation. And during the silent breakthrough, you also stop explaining yourself, not intentionally, but naturally, because you no longer feel the need to justify the process to others. And explanation requires translation, and translation weakens internal clarity, because external language cannot capture internal architecture. And the more aligned you become, the less interested you are in external interpretation, because your energy is now invested in execution, not representation. And this is where working without witnesses becomes natural, not heroic, because you are no longer performing growth, you are embodying it. And embodiment does not seek spectators. And another subtle change is that comparison loses its emotional charge, not because you think you are better than others, but because comparison no longer feels relevant to your internal metrics, because your reference point has shifted from others to process, and process is not competitive, it is cumulative. And this shift dissolves envy, resentment, and insecurity at their root, because those emotions require external reference points to survive. And without those reference points, they starve. And what replaces them is neutrality and focus. And this is the mental landscape where mastery grows fastest, because energy is no longer wasted on social positioning, validation seeking, or narrative construction. And the irony is that external results often begin to appear shortly after this internal shift, but by the time they do, you care less about them, because your reward system has already been rewired away from outcome and toward execution. And this is why the silent breakthrough does not feel like arrival. It feels like continuation, like nothing new has started, only something old has stopped. The internal resistance, the emotional negotiation, the identity conflict, the constant questioning. And in that absence, momentum builds naturally. And this momentum is quiet, steady, and difficult to stop, because it is not fueled by emotion, but by structure. And structure is resilient. And the silent samurai recognizes this moment not by celebration, but by silence, because silence is appropriate when the system is finally working. And there is no need to announce alignment, no need to signal transformation, no need to mark the moment, because the real change has already happened where no one can see it. And what follows is not explosion, but accumulation, not spectacle, but compounding, not recognition, but inevitability. And this is the final truth of the invisible phase. Mastery does not arrive. It reveals itself slowly through consistency. And by the time others notice, the transformation is already old inside you. Because the real breakthrough was not the results, but the moment you stopped needing them to continue.